Video game mascots. Pretty much every franchise has that one character that is its mascot. That one character who stands out and is instantly recognizable to both fans and non fans. Halo has the Master Chief, Mass Effect has Commander Shepard, The Legend of Zelda has Link, and Horizon has Aloy. However, only a handful of characters are truly recognizable to everyone. Only a few are known by a simple glance, not just within the gaming community, but around the world. And out of all of those characters, none are as recognizable as Pikachu. Everyone and their mother knows Pikachu. He's Ash's partner, his first Pokemon and best friend. The little yellow mouse who sent Team Rocket blasting off countless times and has entertained generations. But how did Pikachu become the mascot of one of the world's biggest franchises? Well, while you most likely will guess the answer pretty quickly, the journey of how Pikachu and the creators of Pokemon got there is pretty interesting. So let's take a look into how Pikachu became an icon. Pikachu's rise to fame is an interesting journey marked by changes to the early direction of the first game's design, a desire not to alienate fans or disappoint children, and a tiny hint of sexism. Pikachu's status as one of the greatest mascots is just a simple fact of life at this point. From games to movies, references across pop culture and beyond, there are very few mascots as recognizable as Pikachu. But to discover how Pikachu became the mascot of Pokemon, we need to quickly look into how Pokemon was created, all the way back in a strange time known as the 1980s and 1990s. Pre-Pokemon. The early concepts of Pokemon were created by Satoshi Tajiri, who grew up in the suburbs of Tokyo in the 1960s. As a young child, he enjoyed finding and catching insects and other small creatures in the various rural areas that surrounded his hometown. Unfortunately, however, as time passed and the town began expanding, these rural areas were destroyed to make way for progress. And while the creation of Pokemon was still a far off dream for Tajiri, the early ideas were already beginning to take shape. After his hometown began to grow and more land was paved over, Tajiri wanted to create games after getting interested in the local arcade scene. He wanted to create games that allowed children to have the same feelings he had when he caught and collected creatures as a young child. And obviously, as we know, the catching, collecting, and cataloging of Pokemon is such a core part of the games. But it doesn't end there. One of the biggest themes of Pokemon is their harmonious blend of civilization and nature, two worlds that coexist and work side by side. NPCs in Pokemon games are constantly mentioning nature and its importance, and I can only imagine Tajiri thought this as he watched the world he explored as a child be destroyed. Starting in 1981 and ending in 1986, Tajiri ran a magazine called Game Freak, which focused on the Japanese arcade game scene, which he became interested in as the rural areas he explored were lost, as well as game guides and Easter eggs. While Game Freak magazine was short lived, its name did live on. It was sometime in 1989 to 1990 when Tajiri came up with the idea of Pokemon. He was inspired by the idea of people being able to play games together on a Game Boy using the new link cable. For those of you that are too young to remember, a link cable was about 3 feet of wire that you and a friend plugged into your Game Boys. It allowed you to both play multiplayer games together as long as you didn't move far away from each other, shake your Game Boys, or do anything that would cause the cable to fall out. Because if it did, it was game over. They really were some dark times. When Tajiri saw the link cable connecting two Game Boys, he imagined bugs crawling back and forth between the two handhelds. He never really stopped thinking about those bugs. Tajiri saw the link cable as a way of bringing gamers together. He imagined it would allow them to swap useful items with each other so both players could progress through the game without getting stuck. And obviously, this was later implemented with the trading of Pokemon. The production of Pokemon Red and Green. In 1990, Tajiri pitched the initial idea of Pokemon to Nintendo, where most of the staff thought it was a bit too ambitious. However, one man saw its potential and gave it its backing: Shigeru Miyamoto. In fact, while Tajiri thought up the idea of players trading Pokemon with each other, it was Miyamoto who suggested that the Pokemon games should be multiple games each generation, with certain Pokemon only appearing in specific games. This would push players to buy different versions of the game from their friends and require them to trade and work together so they could have all 151 Pokemon. Miyamoto took Tajiri under his wing and acted as a sort of mentor during the very troubled production of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Green. The new Pokemon games took nearly 6 years to develop, and they nearly bankrupted the new Game Freak. During production, 5 employees left Game Freak, and Tajiri never took payment until the games released. But where does Pikachu fit into the development of these games? Well, it took a while for Pikachu to even be considered as a concept. It's probably well known at this point that Rhydon, the bipedal rhino Pokemon, was the first created Pokemon. Although there is some debate about this among some people. Some say Diglett was actually the first created Pokemon, as it was an older design from years before the concept of Pokemon was even conceived. However, it wasn't included in Pokemon until much later in development. So, no, Rhydon was the first Pokemon, but obviously it didn't become the mascot. But it really could have. Rhydon's influence is clearly seen in the first few games. Statues of Rhydon are seen all over the world of Kanto, including the gyms. So why wasn't Rhydon the mascot? You would think that the first created Pokemon would be the face of the franchise. Well, it seems that many thought that Rhydon's overall design was too focused on the male audience. Rhydon was a giant grey monster with a horn on its head, and Tajiri and other developers wanted Pokemon to appeal to all genders, and they just thought that Rhydon couldn't do that. But if Rhydon was the first created Pokemon, where did Pikachu come in? Well, it was about halfway through development. At this point, many of the designs for Pokemon were more Jurassic in their design. Pokemon had a very specific look at this point, and unfortunately, Pikachu just didn't fit into it. Thankfully, however, this did change. The lead designer for Pokemon, Ken Sugimori, believed that the games needed more cute Pokemon, and he was struggling to conceive such designs. Sugimori believed that this was due to him being a man and that they needed a woman's perspective. Enter Atsuko Nishida, a graphic artist for Game Freak who ended up being credited for designs of multiple Pokemon, including Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, and Sylveon. Nishida was tasked with the creation of not just Pikachu but its evolutionary line, and to do this she was given specific guidelines to follow. This new Pokemon had to be an electric type, it needed to evolve twice, which obviously changed, and this final evolution needed to look really strong. This cut evolution was known as Gorochu and was cut due to cartridge space. This actually happened to a lot of the 2 evolution Pokemon in the Gen 1 games. The initial designs of Pikachu did change over time, especially after a lot of feedback from higher ups. It was Tajiri who wanted Pikachu to have a more rodent design, specifically taking elements from mice and squirrels. Despite Pikachu alongside Raichu being added to the games and being tailored to look more cute to the masses, Pikachu wasn't considered any more important than most of the Pokemon that came before or after. In February 1996, Pocket Monsters Red and Green was released in Japan, and Pikachu was introduced to the world. If you could find him, that is. Because Pikachu was actually considered a rare find, with you only being able to find him in 2 locations, Viridian Forest and the Power Plant. Viridian Forest is an early game area, and Pikachu only had about a 5 to 10% encounter rate. This meant he was hard to find, and if you did miss him, it would be a long time before you saw him again. And this may have been a choice by the developers who wanted something rare in the early game. And this early game rarity supposedly did help with Pikachu's popularity, but by how much is unknown. In contrast to Viridian Forest, the power plant is a late game area. By the time you've gotten there, you probably already have or nearly have your final team. Also, the power plant is where you find Zapdos, so Pikachu isn't even close to being the most interesting Pokemon there. So, at launch for Pokemon Red and Green, Pikachu didn't stand out any more than most other Pokemon. Honestly, at launch, the only Pokemon that could be considered mascots were Charizard and Venusaur, and Blastoise when Pokemon Blue launched a year later in 1997. You would think that the three Pokemon on the cover of the boxes, the ones that would be the final form of your starters, would be the mascots. They were the ones that were seen most both in game and in the real world. They were the ones that people saw when they first bought the games. And most likely, they were the ones that the players would play with the most once they got their starters to their final evolution. You would look at your starter Charmander and then look at the Charizard on the box and could only imagine how amazing and badass your Pokemon would be once you got them there. However, this wasn't to be the case. Many might have seen Charizard, Venusaur, and Blastoise as the mascots in the early days, but that's not how things were to be. It's possible that they weren't pushed as mascots at the time, as no one thought the franchise needed a mascot. Perhaps they thought that every game should have its own mascot and that was enough. Or perhaps the success of the games and the later franchise wasn't predicted. I can't imagine Tajiri thought Pokemon would end up where it is today. Post launch. Following the release of Pokemon Red and Green, Pikachu, like all other Pokemon, would feature in the Pokemon trading card game, which launched in October of 1996. However, it would be the Pokemon manga, Pokemon Pocket Monsters, which would get its first issue in November of 1996, where Pikachu got the first chance to be front and center. Sort of. The first issue did feature Pikachu both in the story and on the cover, alongside the protagonist Red and Red's Clefairy. The manga differed quite a bit from the video games and later anime, with most Pokemon being able to speak, regular animals appearing, and Pokemon being able to de-evolve. Plot of the story isn't important here. What is important is that Pikachu is present, but he isn't Red's starter or main Pokemon. Clefairy was. Pikachu acted more in a supporting role. Red's Clefairy was also quite similar to Ash's Pikachu. They were a starter, but not one of the actual main starters. They had their own personality that stood out, and they were more front and center than other Pokemon. And for a while, having Clefairy as the mascot was actually kind of expected. Like Rhydon, Clefairy was created quite early, and visually they are a quite charming Pokemon. Although there is an issue with the design, and I'll get onto that in a second. But why wasn't Clefairy chosen as the mascot? Well, the biggest reason is it's kind of the opposite of Rhydon. The creators of Pokemon thought that Clefairy would push boys away, that the franchise might come across as more for girls rather than for everybody. Now, this might come across as a bit of a sexist choice, and like with Rhydon, it kind of is. We can't use a pink Pokemon as the mascot because little boys won't buy our game. As I said, it's the same argument as why Rhydon wasn't chosen, just in reverse. But I do think it makes sense. I was a young boy in the 90s, and while my parents raised me to never make fun of or dismiss something because it was for girls, I can't imagine I would have jumped at the chance to watch a show or play a game with a bright pink ball with a sing-song voice as its mascot. The general design of Clefairy also doesn't really work as a mascot either. It's a very common design. As I said, Clefairy resembles a bright pink ball with little arms and a little tuft of hair. Just like Clefable, just like Jigglypuff, just like Wigglytuff, and even a bit like Chansey. Hell, Clefairy even looks a lot like Kirby. Now, of course, these Pokemon do all look unique and different, but they are way too similar for the casual observer, which of course is who a mascot should attract, especially in the early days of your franchise. And thankfully, this isn't an issue that Pikachu would face, but we'll get onto that a little bit later on. Because of these reasons, Clefairy was given the boot as a possible mascot for the franchise. It would be in 1997 when Pikachu stepped away from being the sidekick and became the franchise's mascot with the release of the Pokemon anime. The Pokemon anime. For many people, myself included, the Pokemon anime was an important part of their childhood and an introduction to the franchise. And as you're probably already aware, or have guessed, this is where Pikachu became the mascot we all know and love. This is where he went from this rare Pokemon that was missed or ignored by many to a face recognized the world over. But how Pikachu got chosen and his success post pilot episode is a bit of a journey in itself. The first episode of the anime, Pokemon I Choose You, aired in Japan on April 1st, 1997, and on September 8th, 1998 for its English air date. Unlike in the manga, we didn't follow the adventures of Red. we followed a new hero, Ash Ketchum of Pallet Town, who, to be fair, does look a little bit like Red. In this first episode, Ash is about to head off on his own adventures to become a Pokemon master. Unfortunately for Ash, however, he wakes up late on the day he's to pick his starter Pokemon, and rather than getting one of the iconic three that we all know from the games, Ash is stuck with a very misbehaved Pikachu. A Pikachu that refuses to listen to him, get into its Pokeball, and regularly attacks Ash. By the end of the first episode, after a nasty run in with some Spearow, Ash and Pikachu form a bond that has existed for decades. Pokemon I Choose You is a very good pilot. It sets up the world, shows us how it works, and introduces us to some very likable characters. And that includes Pikachu. But why was Pikachu chosen as the starter Pokemon for Ash? Why not something else? It could have easily been Charmander, Squirtle, or Bulbasaur, who were shown at the start of the episode. In fact, when Ash arrives at Professor Oak's, he initially chooses Squirtle, although Squirtle and the others have already been chosen at this point. While this is the in-world answer as to why Ash got stuck with Pikachu, the real-world answer is favoritism, or a fear of favoritism. Many of the show's heads, including Kunihiko Yuyama, who served as the show's creative director from day one until 2023, were afraid that if Ash picked one of the original three as a starter, it would elevate it above the other two and imply that there was in fact a correct choice. Or more importantly, that your choice was wrong. Ash chose Squirtle, so you were wrong for picking Bulbasaur. There was a genuine fear among the production team that they could alienate the audience. In the end, they did have Ash obtain the original three starters, just in his own unique way. Although they did end up showing a significant amount of favoritism when it came to Charmander slash Charizard and their whole plotline. In 2023, Yuyama talked about why Pikachu was so important and was chosen to be Ash's companion. He didn't want children to feel sad. It was that simple. Also, Pikachu, unlike Clefairy, works very well in the design category. Pikachu is very unique. The choice of yellow as the main colour is quite distinctive. It stands out, especially at a distance or in large crowds. The Pokemon logo itself is also mainly yellow. This might just be a coincidence, but I do think it is a small, notable connection. When it came to the Gen 1 Pokemon, only a few were yellow in colour, but they looked nothing like Pikachu. Combine this with the red and black highlights in the cheeks and ears and the lightning bolt tail, Pikachu was very unique. It's also worth noting that a yellow mascot was kind of a rarity at this point. Winnie the Pooh, The Simpsons, and Big Bird are the only other yellow characters I've been able to find for this time period. When it came to the other Pokemon, Pikachu easily stood out from his counterparts. He's very different from Rattata and Raticate, the only other Pokemon from Gen 1 that are rodent inspired. Only Sandshrew comes close to being similar in colour and design, but even then, that's a bit of a stretch. But as well as standing out, the design is also rather simple. Odds are that most people could draw Pikachu from memory quite easily, which is really good when most of your audience is children. Partner this with a simple but memorable name, and the design of Pikachu could only be a hit. And unlike the other potential mascots, Pikachu also didn't really fall into a gender norm design. He didn't appear to be just for boys or just for girls. Pikachu was for everyone. I think one factor that worked really well in Pikachu's favour also is that he looks like a real animal. An animal that young children might like or even own. Two of my favourite Pokemon from Gen 1 are Growlithe and Arcanine. And why? Because I like dogs. It's that simple. Mice might be a somewhat strange pet, but if you owned one, I imagine you loved seeing that small electric mouse taking down bad guys and bigger opponents like they were nothing. And that's kind of it. Through a change in tone for the first games to have more cute Pokemon, to having Pikachu play second fiddle in the manga, to trying to avoid favoritism to the original starters or a specific gender, Pokemon had its mascot in Pikachu. But Pikachu's success is more than just a bunch of corporate choices for a cute character that could appeal to everyone. Because it's not just Pikachu who is the mascot, it's Ash's Pikachu who is the mascot. I've always believed that it was the anime that made Pokemon such a success. and many of Pokemon's creators agree with that. While the games did launch in Japan in 1996, it wouldn't be until September and October of 1998 that they launched for the rest of the world, alongside the anime. And as I said, the anime was my introduction to Pokemon, and I know a lot of people who are the same. So we started off with Pikachu, Ash's Pikachu, as our first Pokemon. And if not for Pikachu, I don't think the show would have been as much as a success as it actually was. Ash is the main protagonist in the anime, and he's quite a likable protagonist. He's funny, positive, upbeat. He cares about his friends and Pokemon, putting himself in harm's way to protect them on multiple occasions. He can be a bit arrogant and clueless to the world around him, but he has an unrelenting determination to keep trying, no matter how many times he's failed in the past. As I said, he is a likable protagonist. He's a believable one. But I think that one of the smartest choices made for the anime was making Pikachu as much of a fleshed out character and protagonist as Ash. The bond and relationship between Ash and Pikachu is an important one. It's core to the entire show. They may have a different relationship at the start, but this quickly changes. They become inseparable and incredibly important to each other. Neither can go on without the other. The bond between Ash and Pikachu is a standout for the show. Ash doesn't treat Pikachu like a player of one of the games would treat their Pokemon. He's not pushed to be the strongest and then traded out when something stronger comes along. Ash doesn't treat Pikachu or any of his Pokemon like tools to use in his journey, but as friends, as family. And this loyalty goes both ways. During the show, Pikachu has entire scenes, episodes, shorts, and story arcs focused solely on him. His character is as varied as Ash or any others. He's sulky and angry one minute, then cute and funny in the next, perhaps a little sadistic at times, but a complete badass at the end. One element that I think helps solidify him as an individual is Pikachu's desire not to evolve. This separated him from many other Pokemon. It made him unique. We see many of Ash's Pokemon evolve in the show, and he's always happy when it happens. But once he saw that Pikachu didn't want to evolve, he didn't push it. And that's really good, because that would take away from Pikachu as a character. He would be a Pikachu, not the Pikachu. That's the in world perspective. From a real world perspective, Pikachu was probably kept as a Pikachu, so fans had something to bond with, which is what a good mascot needs. He was probably also kept as a Pikachu because he was small, so he could easily fit into a scene, whether in the foreground or the background. He could always be there doing something. Had he evolved into a Raichu or been any other larger Pokemon, keeping him out of the Pokeball and having him constantly be around in every single scene would have been a bit difficult. Which is very good considering how regularly the show cycled out human characters and Ash's Pokemon. Like Ash, Pikachu is one of the few constants in the show, something familiar and likable for audiences to latch onto. You could skip multiple seasons, but Ash and Pikachu would still be there, still recognizable, still familiar. As I mentioned earlier, the success of the franchise is linked to the success of the show. It was able to appeal and reach a larger audience, which the games couldn't do, especially in the early days. The shows brought Pokemon and Pikachu to a wider audience. And it's very safe to say that Pikachu played a big part in the success of the show. And this ended up creating a cascade effect. Pikachu made the show successful, and the show made Pikachu more popular, which meant more people continued to watch the show, making it a continued success. And then you just rinse and repeat for 28 years. Post anime. Following the show's success, Game Freak worked on and released Pokemon Yellow between 1998 and 2000, depending on where you lived in the world. It was the first spin off game and it brought elements of the show to the games. Ash and Gary were options for the names of the player and the rival. Some characters were redesigned to resemble the show, and obviously Pikachu was your starter who followed you around, just like Ash's Pikachu. It's been 30 years since Pokemon came into the world through Pokemon Red and Green, and nearly 29 years since the show began. The franchise has had its lows and highs, but the success of the franchise cannot be denied. Since then, Pikachu has appeared in every mainline Pokemon game except Black and White, many of the spin offs like Mystery Dungeon or Pokemon Go, and in other games and franchises entirely like Super Smash Bros. He was one of many Pokemon used by Japan as a mascot in the 2014 FIFA World Cup. He's been in all 23 animated films and has had his own live action film, which I think is very underrated. He's had his own versions of Nintendo consoles and has even been a regular sight at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, having appeared in the parade for over 20 years. This is just a few small ways Pikachu has been used in his mascot role for Pokemon. And some might even say that Pikachu is overused. Kotaku made this argument stating that his overuse undermined other Pokemon in the series and showed a lack of originality. While the gamer believed that Pikachu's consistent presence in marketing had made him uninteresting and an ineffective mascot, which I don't agree with at all. For one thing, a mascot is meant to be used in everything. It's kind of the point. Also, Pokemon isn't like other franchises. It's multiple stories that aren't really connected with each other, told across a vast array of media. Each game does have its own mascot. Red has Charizard, Emerald has Rayquaza, but they only work for their own games. Blastoise can't be the mascot for Shield, and Ho-Oh can't be the mascot for Violet. So you need one mascot for the entire franchise, as well as giving each game its own separate one. Pokemon needs a reliable, recognizable, and lovable mascot that can bring all of it together. It needs Pikachu. Pikachu has had a long life in the limelight, being the face of Pokemon, and he'll probably continue to do this for years to represent the Pokemon franchise in games, anime, and movies. Pikachu is never going to be replaced, and he doesn't need to be, because he fulfills the role of a mascot brilliantly. Is loving Pikachu so much and having him as your favorite a bit basic? Well, yes, it kind of is. But you can go ahead and call me basic. However, it cannot be denied that over the past 30 years, Pikachu has succeeded in his role as the perfect mascot for Pokemon. Hey guys, I hope you liked that video, and if you did, do give it a like and a comment because it'd be greatly appreciated. You can check out similar videos as well on the channel, and of course you can subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all content going forward, and check me out on TikTok and on Medium as well. And I'll see you next time.